Hey there. So I want to talk a little bit to you guys who are remote workers. Gather around. Because I've been getting a lot of inquiries of late from people who are working remotely about whether in fact they have to go back to the office because employers are calling their employees back to the office en masse. So I'm going to give you my opinion about how most of these situations will pan out for people who are remote workers. And I'll offer some caveats and some things for you to think about if this is you in these scenarios. So especially for those of you who were in the office workers up until COVID, or you were working from home 1 day or 2 days a week, and then you went full-time remote work because of COVID, and then you have been working from home ever since. And I'm also talking to those of you who may have been hired into your roles as remote workers while COVID was happening, and you continued to work remotely, but now your employer is telling you that you either have to come back full-time into the office or you have to come back in some kind of hybrid. What I'm hearing a lot from people is they're asking them to come in 1 day a week. And a lot of people who were hired during COVID took these jobs. Sometimes the jobs are an hour, 2 hours drive away. But they took the job with the understanding they would be working remotely. And now they're being asked to come into work. And it's like, you want me to drive an hour and a half or 2 hours every day, both ways to come to work. And so people are asking me, well, can they say no? Can they refuse? I've had people tell me, oh, I refused. Here's my short answer. If your employer wants you to come back to work and you don't want to come back to work, they can fire you for not coming back, right? In most situations, in most places. Now, here are things that you can consider to try to push back on that. A key thing is going to be making an ally out of your manager. So if the person who hired you and hired you with an understanding that you were going to be a remote worker, but now HR has sent down something saying everybody's got to come back, have a conversation with your manager about whether or not they're willing to give you a pass and look the other way if you don't come in, right? Because a lot of times if your manager doesn't enforce it, depending on what kind of company you work for and the size of the company, HR isn't going to get involved unless your manager gets them involved. So I say start with your manager, have conversations with your manager and see whether your manager is willing to recognize that you were hired with an understanding that you were going to be a remote worker. And now they're kind of changing the rules of the game. And it could be a significant hardship financially and otherwise for you to have to come back into the office. The other thing I would recommend that you do is go look at your letter of hire, right? And see what it says. Does it specifically say that you are a remote worker or does it not? Here's a big mistake that many people did. They made the assumptions that they were classified as remote workers because they were allowed to work from home. Just because you were allowed to work from home because of a pandemic doesn't make you a, quote, remote worker, unquote. You're still classified as whatever they classified you at hire. So in many companies, if you are hired with the intention of being remote, not only are you classified as a remote worker, you usually may have a remote work agreement that lays out the parameters for you working at home. You may also get equipment and other things to use to work from home while you are employed. If that applies to you, you have a stronger argument that you should not be expected to come back into the office. Now, of course, they can still try to change your classification, but you can hold up a piece of paper that shows that from the time you were hired, the intention was that you were never supposed to come into the office. The problem is that a lot of employers intentionally hired people, told them they could be remote, but they classified them as regular full-time staff. There's no remote work actually attached to their titles or their classifications, which allows the employer to pull the things that all these employers are pulling, right? So I would recommend that you take a look at your paperwork to see if they classified you a remote worker. The other thing is to pay attention to who else is in the companies getting to work remotely and make sure there's not any pattern of practice that might be discriminatory. Pay attention to who gets to work from remotely and who's being told to come into the office, because that may also be an angle that you can raise if you see any patterns of unfair treatment along the lines of who's allowed to work remotely and who's not, right? And then the last thing that I would say is, again, try to negotiate getting your classification changed to remote. If you know that when your manager hired you, it was understood that you were going to work from home full time, and that was the understanding, and your employer has a remote worker classification and there are other people that are being allowed to work remotely, talk to your manager about whether you can change your classification and become a remote worker. Now, again, you're going to need to have a partnership with your manager on that to make that happen, right? But it's an angle that you can consider, because yes, in fact, to answer the question, can my company order me back to the office? In most cases, the answer is yes. So there are workarounds that I've just provided in here and things that you can consider to try to get around that. But if none of the things I've mentioned work for you, you may need to start looking for another job. Because if you refuse to come back to work, they can argue that you have abandoned your job. They can argue that you're violating the policy, and they can use that to sever employment with you, especially if you're not classified as a remote worker, right? But even if you are, they could just try to change your classification. But that's a different thing to deal with than if you don't have that classification at all. You just think you are a remote worker in your head. So, and as I said, unless you can show that there's a pattern and practice in the company that certain groups of people are being allowed to work remotely versus other groups of people, you can't claim it as discrimination because they won't let you work remotely. So I think you got to be really careful about throwing that term around in the context of remote work unless you can really prove differential treatment. But I wanted to, make this video because it's come up a couple times now with people contacting me to ask me, like, if my employer orders me back to work and I was hired as a remote worker, do I have to come back? And in most cases, the answer is, yeah, you do. But there are things for you to consider if you want to have conversations with your company about why they should give you a waiver or why they should allow you to continue to work remotely. So I hope that this video was helpful. I'm Anne Marie, the anti-HR HR lady. HR is not your enemy, but they're definitely not your friend. But I am. I'll see you in the next video. Bye. Oh, and don't forget, for a limited time, my online course, How to Ask for an Exit from a Discriminatory Hostile Work Environment with Cash and Actually Get It, is on sale for $199 this Black History Month. So make sure that you grab a copy so that you know what to do if you are put in a position where you feel that you're being discriminated against and you would like to leave. Make sure that you leave, but not without your coins. You can grab access to the course by visiting my website, the AntiHR-HRlady.com. You'll see it right at the bottom of the screen. And I hope that it will help you to understand and know how to assert your workplace rights when you're dealing with discrimination.